decided to put together a little video of my new brewing system. Today we're going to do an APA, American Pale Ale. We've got a three-tiered system. On top of the fridge we've got the HLT table, we have the mash tun, and on the floor we've got our boil kettle. The first step in creating any all-grain brew is to weigh out our grains. In this case we're going to be using about 80% two-row, 10% Vienna, and 10% crystal. I've seen a variety of methods for weighing out the grains. In my case I have a postal scale, so we just tar the pail on the scale and add our grains. So it makes for a really simple weighing system. In terms of grinding the grains, I actually have a little Frankenstein mill that I sort of kludge together onto a piece of wood with a Javex bottle. It actually works really well and it grinds the grain very efficiently. So we can do this whole pail of grain in a few minutes. Grinding the grain is actually a somewhat dusty process, so I actually like to do this out on the back deck. It keeps the dust from the grains from possibly getting into the brew. Sometimes there's some bacteria that are actually present and it can actually infect the beer. Here we can see that we got a good crush out of our mill. We've broken the grains up, exposing the inside, but we haven't shredded the husk. So that's basically what we're looking for in a good crush. So here we're ready to mash in. We've got our HLT temperature up at about 175, which is basically what we want to mash in. We want to have our mash temperature at about 152. So we'll go ahead and add the water and add our grains, and we'll be ready to start the mash. We've got our paint stirrer handy and ready to go. Here are our grains ready to be added into the mash. So I've gone ahead and mashed in off camera. I just couldn't get the camera mounted in such a way as to do this and stir the mash. So we can see we're pretty close to our mash temperature, a little high, but that's because we just mashed in. We need to let everything equalize still. Here we can see the mash. We've got a good amount of water in there. We had to add a little extra just to get things set up just right and hit the right temperature. So we've got our thermometer in there, and the mash seems to be going well so far. We'll give the mash a final stir with our paint stir. It actually does a really good job of mixing up the mash and stirring things, keeping it consistent. Of course, the hot water also helps to fog up our camera. Started the sparge here. You can see the wort is beginning to drain into our boil kettle. I use a method called fly sparging, and basically that involves getting a continuous flow of water going. What we want to do is keep about an inch of water on top of our grain bed. So we can see here the grain bed is completely covered with water, and we have a slow stream of water feeding in out of our HLT. During the sparging process is where we actually use all three vessels. So we have our hot water, that's at about 170 in our HLT. That water slowly drains into the mash tun and rinses the sugars off the mash. Then we have our sweet wort basically draining into our boil kettle. Well, once we've collected that all, we can actually go ahead and boil. Here's another shot of the grain bed. So we can see we've got it nicely covered with water. We've got a nice even flow of water going in. And that's basically rinsing the sugars and driving those sugars down through the grain bed on a sort of continuous basis. Here we can see the wort collecting in the boil kettle. We haven't reached the heating element yet, but once we do, we can turn on the heat and actually get things up to slowly up to boiling temperature. The sparging process actually takes about 45 minutes. We want to drain the liquid relatively slowly to make sure we get a good efficiency in terms of gathering the sugar out of the grain bed. We've actually covered the heating element now, so we've got the heating element on low. You can see here that we could actually use a little more water on the grain bed. It's still covered, but just barely. We've collected all the wort into our boil kettle. We've turned the heat on and we have a nice rolling boil going. At this point we can add our hops. You can see we've got a nice vigorous boil going. The vigorous boil allows us to get what's called hot break, and that's proteins that are in the grains, and they will coagulate together and eventually settle to the bottom. So we can see our spent grains here. We've completed the boiling stage, we've cooled the wort, and now we've actually drained it into our carboys. You can see the froth on top of the wort. That was actually caused by the aeration process, where we purposely let the wort drain into the carboy from a height, causing splashing and aerating the wort. The aeration is actually important for the yeast, because the yeast actually requires oxygen in its initial stages. We did take a gravity reading. We ended up a little higher than we expected, but that's because we're still figuring out the system.